That Aristotle is in a way the father of determinism should come as no great surprise to those who know anything about his philosophy. And it will also not come as a surprise that he discovered all three versions of determinism, namely logical, physical, and ethical determinism. By logical determinism, I mean the problem that has been discussed under the title of future truth, i.e. the truth of propositions about particular contingent events in the future. Physical determinism concerns the question whether causal constellations make the outcome of all events necessary. And ethical determinism concerns the question whether the psychological conditions determine the way humans act. If I say that Aristotle discovered all three of these sorts of determinism, I do not want to deny that there had been earlier discussions among certain philosophers whether all things happen out of necessity or whether certain things come to be by chance and in a haphazard way. Certain pre-Socratics seem to have entertained such views, but we do not have clear evidence, for instance, about the fine-grainedness of Democritus's theory of atomic interaction. And although Plato distinguishes the realm of what is eternally self-same and immobile from the realm of what is changeable and unreliable, this very separation prevents him from raising the question whether ordinary things, including human actions, are in a way necessitated. And although Plato sometimes speaks about the law of destiny, by that he only means the fate that is in store for human beings after death, depending on how they have lived their lives. But these theories, if they can be called theories at all, were so general that it does not seem that any of those thinkers as much as raised the question of whether there is an uninterrupted series of causes that necessitates the outcome, and whether these kinds of causal constellations include human agents. Aristotle thoroughly changed the scene by not only differentiating between the different kinds of determinism, I won't go into their interaction, but also by refining those questions. But despite the fact that he worked out the three versions of determinism, he was apparently not at all troubled by the fact that the world is determined in these three ways. For the way he presents the different forms of determinism shows that at the same time he does not regard any of them as real problems. Since my time is limited, I will only give brief sketches of his treatment of logical and physical determinism insofar as they shed light on Aristotle's position in general, and then turn to ethical determinism because that is the topic of this conference. Aristotle, by the way, did not invent any such vocabulary. In principle, he had at his disposition terms like determined or indeterminate, but he used them in the same sense of definite or indefinite, not determinate and indeterminate in the sense that signifies determinism. Needless to say, the term determinism, like most isms, is an invention of the early modern age. There were no such terms used in antiquity. Aristotle did introduce, however, a special term for contingency, endechomenon, for what is neither necessary nor impossible, and that term has come down to us via its Latin translation contingens by Cicero, and that is the terminology, so to speak, in antiquity. I now come briefly to logical determinism, future truth. By that I mean the discussion of future truth in the famous chapter 9 of the Interpretatione. The problem is also called, for short, the sea battle, because Aristotle uses a sea battle that supposedly will happen tomorrow as his example to specify the question whether statements concerning future contingent events are already true or false beforehand. If so, he claims, then the events must be regarded as settled, that is, as necessary as well. This question used to be a hot topic in those years when the principle of bivalence was still regarded as a kind of sacred cow by logicians. But nowadays it's no longer treated that way. Logicians have turned to many-valued or even to fuzzy logic, and so bivalence is no longer a must. No one seems to be ready, therefore, to take up the cudgel and fight the sea battle again. If Aristotle does accept statements about future particular contingent events from that principle that every proposition must be either true or false, that exception is no longer regarded as strange. At any rate, people no longer attribute to him the simple logical mistake, you have it on your handout, of inferring from necessarily true P or false P, therefore necessary P or necessary that not P. It should be noted that Aristotle makes clear in the text itself that the way we think or talk about events does not affect their character. Things don't become necessary just because we call them that way. Aristotle's point is rather that the way we think and talk about states of affairs should fit the ontological status we attribute to them. So the problem concerns us and not the events themselves. If we regard an event as open either way, namely that it may or may not happen, then we should not treat it as fixed, which we would do if we assume that the proposition that it will happen has been true all along. In short, will be is not compatible with may be or may not be. To express it in a more poetical way, the assumption that all statements about future events have been true or false since the dawn of creation means that the book of history must have been written at that time. Aristotle does of course not use any such poetic metaphors, and he does not believe in creation anyway. But he holds that we should keep separate things that we regard only as likely to happen and things that are definitely going to happen. Future truth is for Aristotle a matter of our semantic treatment of future contingents that is therefore easily settled. But the problem of future truth became an issue again later in history, especially when certain philosophers and theologians became concerned with the question of God's omniscience. If God foresees and possibly foretells all things, must such foresights not be true? And do these things then not happen of necessity? But luckily for Aristotle, the Greek gods were not omniscient, so that problem did not concern him. I come now to physical determinism. Aristotle is equally brief about the problem of physical necessity. He is convinced that in nature only certain things happen of necessity, while others are contingent. Even if they are of the kind that happens for the most part, particular events may or may not happen depending on the circumstances. Of course, every event that happens is necessary when it happens. There are no causal gaps in Aristotle's physical world. But in the sublunary world, there are no trains of events that cannot, in principle, be interrupted by some interference, an interference that is not foreseeable because it comes from outside the context. Aristotle calls those interfering factors accidental and distinguishes them from things that happen by nature, physei. And such accidental events are not the subjects of any science because they are irregular and therefore unforeseeable. In Aristotle's universe, only the superlunary sphere, the world above the moon, is free from accidents. As he saw it, only the heavenly bodies move on regular paths forever. Comets and other such irregular phenomena he therefore located in the sublunary sphere. This does not mean that Aristotle accepted the existence of uncaused events, for accidental causes are causes as well. As Aristotle explains in Metaphysics Epsilon 2-3, accidental events are events that come to be and cease to be, but are not themselves the products of proper processes of generation or destruction. You have the text on your handout number 1, that there are, and I should change the translation, not principles, but first points and causes which are generable and destructible without ever being in the cause of being generated or destroyed, is obvious. For otherwise all things will be of necessity, since that which is being generated or destroyed must have a cause which is not accidentally its cause. In nature, there are natural trains of events that happen all the time, unless something from outside interferes, which is not part of that natural train of events. In human life, accidentals are interferences that are neither intended nor foreseeable. Thus, I become an accidental witness of a car crash if I happen to be there for some quite different purpose, and car crashes do not happen there all the time. Accidents, both in nature and in human life, are not uncaused, but they do not come into being. That is, there is no process in the nature of things that leads up to them, and that is why there is no science of them. The conception of the accidental essentially depends on Aristotle's teleology. It is because he assumes that natural events happen regularly and lead up to their specific ends that he can treat factors that interrupt such natural trains of events as accidentals that just happen. There are no uncaused causes in nature, for everything that happens of necessity once it happens, but in the case of accidentals, the necessity arises only when it happens. All contingent events at certain points turn into necessary events when there's nothing that can prevent their happening any longer. Once the sea battle has started, there necessarily is a sea battle. But we have to cut this discussion short. Although it is necessary that every human being will die, it is not necessary that a certain individual will be murdered or die of a certain disease as long as certain conditions do not obtain. A certain victim may just have been the wrong person in the wrong place, as we often say, so that he became the victim accidentally. But that, of course, would not have been so if the murderers had plotted to get him. But given the possibility of accidentals, there is no uninterruptible series of causes from the dawn of creation that leads up to that event. And that is the reason why Aristotle claims that there are first beginnings or first starts that do not have further proper beginnings as their causes, so that this particular train of events has been necessary all along. Determinists who acknowledge no such teleological distinctions will, of course, not be impressed by Aristotle's explanation. They will object that unforeseeable events are so only because not everything is known to us. Aristotle would, of course, reply that only certain types of events are knowable as a matter of principle, and that many possibilities are not among the knowables. But rigorous determinists will include the entire state of the universe from one moment to the next in their account and not care about knowability. But in that case, everything, even the most unlikely event, happens of necessity. But this means that the distinction between natural and non-natural trains of events will have to be given up. But this is where we shall leave the debate about physical necessity and turn to the third and last and most interesting point, to ethical determinism. Readers of the Nicomachean Ethics may wonder at first why ethics should be included in this discussion, given that Aristotle starts out there with a warning not to expect from ethics the same kind of precision as of mathematics. For there is a lot of fluctuation in ethical matters, so that one should be satisfied with premises that indicate the truth only roughly and in outline, and to expect consequences of the same type. In ethics, there are no strict precepts, they rather apply only for the most part. Given this principle of uncertainty, why include ethics in discussions of determinism? Aristotle's warning against expecting precision in ethics is often misunderstood. It does not mean that the basic concepts and principles of ethics lack precision. It only means that there are no precise general rules about what is right and wrong in particular actions, because adjustments will have to be made to the particular circumstances, namely who the agent is and in what relation he stands to the person who is affected by his action, the moment of action, the means available, and so on. Aristotle compares the situation of an agent in ethics to that of a captain at sea and a doctor in medicine. Though there are general rules, of course, they need adjustment to the particular situation, as in the case of a heavy storm or in the case of a particular patient in a critical condition. But this uncertainty about what is right or wrong about a particular situation suggests that the agent is free to make those adjustments. So one may wonder why there should be a question concerning freedom and determinism in Aristotle's ethics. For apart from the uncertainty condition of human actions, Aristotle does not even have a suitable terminology. Freedom, eleutheria, is used only in the political sense of free birth and autonomy, and notoriously in classical Greek there was also no term denoting a will as an independent psychological faculty. Instead, Aristotle uses a different term in his discussion of human actions that concerns us, namely whether and under what conditions our actions are up to us, ephemine. And this is the term that was used later in the century-long debates about freedom and determinism between the Stoics, who were card-carrying determinists, and their opponents, the Epicureans, the Peripatetics, and of course also the skeptics. If Aristotle is treated as the father of that debate, that is so because in the Nicomachean Ethics he is very much concerned with the conditions under which our actions are up to us. They must be voluntary, that is, committed with knowledge of the circumstances and without compulsion by external force. Furthermore, they must be in accordance with our own deliberation and choice, and their aim or end must be in accordance with our wishes. All this is pointed out with great care and quite extensively in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 3. So why should there be a problem concerning determinism? For it seems quite clear that our actions are up to us in the sense that we can either do them or leave them as long as there is no outside compulsion or we are not in ignorance about any particular facts. There is, nevertheless, a problem whether human actions, according to Aristotle, are determined. If there is a problem, then it lies in the question whether human actions are determined by the agent's character. For not only does Aristotle not deny this, it is one of the main concerns of his ethics, namely to ensure by the right kind of habituation and education from early on that people acquire firm dispositions to do the right things under the right circumstances and avoid the wrong ones. For this is precisely what people will be unable to do who have acquired the wrong dispositions of character. Therefore, the designation of the right moral education is the hallmark of Aristotelian ethics. It does not just concern the virtues of character that are acquired by the adequate habituation and training, it also concerns the acquisition of practical reason, of phronesis. How this acquisition works is one of the central points of Aristotle's ethics. Habituation is not as simple as it sounds, for he does not mean habits acquired by drill, like that of using knives and forks, or swimming or riding bicycles. Instead, he is concerned with the acquisition of the right emotional setup and the right kind of practical thinking when it comes to making decisions. How that works fills a large part of the Nicomachean Ethics, and therefore I cannot go into any details here. Suffice it to say that we are determined by our character, that the fact that we are determined by our character is not regarded as a problem by Aristotle. It is in fact the very idea and aim of his ethics. For this is what moral education is all about. It is to ensure that the morally well brought up person will do the right thing under the right circumstances. Aristotle would therefore certainly find the question puzzling whether the morally properly brought up person cannot help doing the right thing. For him, it's not a question of automatically doing or thinking the right thing. The agents still have to employ their moral and intellectual faculties to come up with the right decision or with the right solution. But they will do so unless something interferes. So, if all is well in Aristotle, why should there be a problem concerning ethical determinism? There's one point in the Nicomachean Ethics where Aristotle explicitly raises the question whether we are responsible for our own character and therefore for our own actions. He does so immediately after the conclusion of the general argument that our character is up to us in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 3, Chapter 5. In fact, he raises two objections. The first one he brushes aside quickly, while he seems to be somewhat hesitant concerning the second objection. So let us take a brief look at both objections and at the way Aristotle settles them. The first objection takes up Aristotle's contention that one's character is up to oneself, because not only do we actively contribute to its acquisition, but we also have to take good care of it. And Aristotle's hypothetical objection reads as follows, that's text 2, but perhaps someone is the kind of a man not to take care. And he rejects this objection quickly on the ground that carelessness is an acquired trait too. He argues in this case that one does not acquire one's moral habits by slack living without being aware of that fact. For only a fool would not know the consequences of a particular way of living. But if one knows that one is on a slippery slope, so to speak, this means that one accepts one's moral deterioration voluntarily. And Aristotle compares such carelessness with the acquisition of an illness of the body by bad living. Such an acquired bad condition will turn out to be irreversible later, even if the person should then wish to do so. That's text 2, the second half. In that case, it was then, namely initially, open to him not to be ill, but not now, when he has thrown away his chance. Just as when you have let a stone go, it is too late to recover it. But yet it was open to you, up to you, not to throw it, since the moving principle was in you. So too, to the unjust and the self-indulgent man, it was open at the beginning not to become men of this kind, and so they are unjust and self-indulgent men voluntarily. But now that they have become so, it is not possible for them not to be so. Just where the beginning of that slippery slope is of course a good question. One may wonder whether one is not always either too young or too old to have the beginning under one's own control. At first, one is, after all, in the hands of one's parents and teachers, and later on one has acquired bad habits so that one can no longer get rid of them. But Aristotle seems to think otherwise. He seems to go on the principle that reason sets in at around age 14 so that one understands the values of the world and can adopt or reject them. No one is an inveterate liar or a criminal at that age yet. What happens to someone who grows up in a bad family or in a gang of thieves is another matter, but I will not pursue that here. Aristotle quite consciously endorses then the principle that at a certain stage of one's development, it is indeed no longer up to us what we are like, morally speaking, and that also applies to our respective decisions and actions. That we are determined by our character, for better or worse, is for Aristotle rather the central point of his ethics, and it's, as I said, its hallmark. For as he sees it, knowledge of the right aim alone is not sufficient. You have to have the right emotional dispositions with the right kind of desire so as to aim for the right end, and to make the right choices by the ways and means to attain that end. That is why Aristotle puts so much emphasis on habituation and education. He keeps repeating in a kind of mantra-like formulation that one must be habited not only to act as one ought to, towards the person one ought to, when one ought to, and so on. And the same oughts also apply to one's feelings, to the pathe. We have to be habituated to feeling the way we ought to, towards the people we ought to, and the way we ought to, and so on. Aristotle often speaks as if the emotions and actions are on a par, that is, equal partners. But reflection shows why this cannot be so. While deliberation and choice concerns one's actions, how one acts, to whom one acts, and so on, that so that actions are chosen, one does not choose one's feelings. They're provoked by some impression, as one could translate pathos in that sense. Because Aristotle does not say much in his Ethics about the emotions and the respective impressionability, his doctrine about the way people are impressed and conditioned to desire certain things in certain ways remains less transparent than one might wish. For in the Nicomachean Ethics, he only enumerates the emotions he has in mind. By emotions, I mean appetite, anger, fear, confidence, envy, joy, love, hatred, longing, emulation, pity, and in general, the feelings that are accompanied by pleasure and pain. Because the emotions are impressions in the soul's non-rational part that are said to be under the guidance of reason, it may seem that there's a kind of division of labor between the passive impressionability and the active decision how to act. At least that is the appearance Aristotle gives in the Nicomachean Ethics books 2 and 3, where he treats emotions and actions as if they are on a par and work hand in hand. That things are not as simple emerges when we look at the definition of the different kinds of emotions in the rhetoric. For it turns out that the mature emotions are, so to speak, cognitively informed responses to a certain situation. The complexity of the emotional response becomes clear, for instance, in the definition of anger in Rhetoric 2:2. You have that on handout text 3. Anger may be defined as a desire accompanied by pain for revenge, for an apparent slight at the hands of men who have no call to slight oneself or one's friends, that is, includes the family. So there is a diagnostic ability and judgment applied in such feelings. But there's more to come, that's the rest of T3. It must be felt because the other has done or intended to do something to him or one of his friends. It must always be attended by a certain pleasure, that which arises from the expectation of revenge. For it is pleasant to think that you will attain what you aim at, and nobody aims at what he thinks he cannot attain. So these are highly trained feelings. They have propositional content, for they do not only assess the kind of injury, but also the satisfaction that is going to be expected. And such emotions clearly are not the raw feelings that we share with young children and animals. Feelings are then much more complex than the discussion in the ethics lead one at first to expect. This is worth noting, for it explains what Aristotle means when he says the end or aim, the telos of an action, is determined by one's character, for better or worse. For it is the wish, a kind of desire, that settles the end. Unfortunately, Aristotle is not very explicit about wish in the short chapter that he dedicates to it. But he explains that wishes are caused by what appears good to the particular person, whether it is really so or only apparently so. The good person has the right impressions and the bad person the wrong ones. This is text 4. The good person judges, crine, each class of things rightly, and each case the truth appears to him. For each state of character has its own noble and pleasant object, and perhaps the good person differs from others most by seeing the truth in each thing, being, as it were, the norm and measure of them. It is worth noting that Aristotle does not say that the object of wish is a matter of choice. Choice is concerned rather with the action that leads up to that end. The end itself is determined by the impression that one has of what is desirable, and these impressions also depend on one's acquired dispositions, on one's character. The reason why I pour out all this information is that it becomes clear that the determination of one's actions, insofar as the aim or end is concerned, is not a matter of rational choice only, but also a matter of one's semi-rational character. They are not raw feelings, but they do contain the impression what is good about an end. And that is why I want to call wish not a rational desire, as many interpreters do, but a rationally informed desire. Why is all this important? It is so because it's directly connected with Aristotle's second objection against the possibility that our character is up to us, an objection that is more serious than the first objections about the person who is such as not to care. For Aristotle acknowledges there, in a way, that humans are not all born alike and do not all have the same chance. He admits so in response to an argument to that extent, again in Nicomachean Exercise 3.5, and we do not know whether Aristotle is concerned there with an actual objection by an opponent or whether that this is a self-fabricated objection. Aristotle often does that. He takes up the notion that everyone acts for what he regards as best, and that this depends on what impression he has of what is best. This is text 5. And the aiming at the end is not self-chosen, but one must be born with an eye, as it were, by which to judge rightly and choose what is truly good. And he is well endowed by nature who is well endowed with this. For it is what is greatest and most noble, and we cannot get or learn from another, but must have it, just as it was given to us at birth, and to be well endowed with this will be perfect and too excellent of natural endowment. If this is true, then how will virtue be more voluntary than vice? To both men alike, the good and the bad, the end appears and is fixed by nature, or however it may be, and it is by referring everything else to this that this man will do whatever they do. That Aristotle should take up this objection is in itself very strange, for much earlier in the Nicomachean Ethics he has rejected the possibility that humans are by nature good or bad, either as a kind of gift of the gods or by chance. But that is not the only thing that is strange about the way Aristotle deals with this objection. For in his further comments he does not reject it offhand, but leaves open the question whether or not the aim or end appears good or bad to a person by nature. Instead, he concentrates only on the fact that the choice of the means that lead up to the agent are up to the agent himself, as an argument that his actions are up to him. But in a way, he seems to admit here that agents have only a diminished kind of responsibility. That's text 6. If then, as is asserted, the virtues are voluntary, for we are ourselves somehow co-causes of our state of character, and it is by being persons of a certain kind that we set the end to be so and so, the vices also will be voluntary, for the same is true of them. This seems to be a strong concession to the notion that there are natural predispositions with respect to virtue and vice. And it is kind of concession that we do not find anywhere else in Aristotle's Ethics. For nowhere else does he mention a natural eye for what is a good end, nor does he restrict the responsibility for the acquisition of one's character to call humans as only co-causes. The word synaitios is not used anywhere else in the Ethics. And elsewhere in Aristotle it usually designates necessary but not sufficient conditions. And I have to add, in legal discussions, a synaitios is an accomplice to a crime. Now this discussion concerning a natural eye and co-responsibility comes only at the very end of Aristotle's general discussion of virtues of character before he enters the discussion of the particular kinds. So he may have felt that the concession of such limiting conditions, even if was not of much importance for his overall theory. Furthermore, Aristotle has mentioned before in his general discussion of the conception of virtue of character that humans may differ in their natural predispositions towards one vice rather than another. He therefore gives the advice that one should lean over backwards to correct those bad predispositions. In addition, much later in his Ethics, he mentions that there are natural virtues from birth on, but that those natural virtues need training, because without such training, people are bound to go wrong. So Aristotle, in a way, admits that some people by nature have better cards, morally speaking, than others, but he still insists that a lot depends on what you do with your cards. Be that as it may, it is clear that Aristotle does not regard ethical determinism as a negative, but rather as a positive, and even as a necessary feature of human responsibility. For it is the only guarantee of human reliability. Without moral habituation, we would act in haphazard ways, and that is not a positive condition of human life, nor is it what people usually have in mind when they raise the question of free will or anything being up to us. They usually do not regard unpredictable people who act in erratic or bizarre ways as particularly free, but rather as freaks. Aristotle is quite aware of the fact that there are people who have some natural deficiencies. He discusses not only morbid states and madness, but also compulsive states. His examples are not kleptomaniacs or pyromaniacs, but compulsive nail chewing or plucking out of hair. But apart from such morbid states, he regards human beings as morally malleable by the right kind of education, and of course by the wrong kind of education too. But it is not just such deficiencies of nature that are an impediment to the right moral development. As I said before, Aristotle admits that some people have better cards than others, and it's not always up to them to compensate for that by playing their cards well. As Aristotle says at one point, a person who is poor, very ugly, of a bad family, and friendless is not likely to live a happy life. A certain amount of external goods are necessary, not just for being able to act in the right way, but also for the acquisition of the virtues, because that presupposes being active in the right way from early on. Aristotle does therefore not deny that there is what Bernard Williams has dubbed moral luck with respect to one's moral development. But that is not something that Aristotle would deny anyway. Not everything is up to us, and certain external factors clearly are not. Aristotle once says one has to make the best of what one has got. Just a shoemaker has to make the best of the kind of leather he has got to work with, and a general has to make the best of the kind of army he happens to have. So, ethical determinism, i.e. the way to act in accordance with one's moral and intellectual potential, has its limitations. But Aristotle seems not to be worried by that fact, nor was he worried by ethical determinism as such. Once we have acquired a certain personality, we will always act in kind, unless some external or internal factor prevents us from doing so. But, as I said, he regards this as a positive factor, not as a factor that limits the way we act. In such a case, that still depends on our deliberation and choice. Aristotle was in addition not worried about the possibility that we have a machine in our head whose work we don't fully understand. But that determines what we do, as is suggested by the illustration on the flyer of this conference. For Aristotle did not regard the brains as the organ of thinking. In fact, he did not hold that thinking required any physical organ at all. The brains for Aristotle are just a cooling device, and though he treats the heart as the center of all conscious process, it is not a thinking machine either. Ethical determinism in Aristotle means only that people are determined by their self-acquired moral personality, and that in his eyes is not a negative but a positive fact, because it promises reliability in the case of the good person and at least predictability in the case of the bad one. Could people act then otherwise than in accordance with their desires and considerations? Of course they could, but they would have to have reasons for such deviations. Although Aristotle does not discuss conflicts at any length, he acknowledges their existence, and he does not go into a casualty at all, so he doesn't discuss all our little problems that bothers philosophers nowadays so much. So, for him there is no strict predictability of what a person will do, and Aristotle never says that morally conditioned person necessarily will do what they do. The odds that Aristotle talks about concerns our moral insights, namely how one ought to act to the person one ought, at the moment one ought, and for the purpose one ought. These odds are not compelling factors, but they are determined by the standards that the morally mature person has accepted, and that, at least in a good community, are generally accepted. There's no compulsion implied here, but only the acknowledgement of what is the right thing to do, all things considered. All this explains why Aristotle does regard humans to a degree as determined by their personality, and also why he regards that as a good thing, politically speaking, as a necessary thing if a community is to function properly. For people have to be able to rely on each other, and that means that they do as a whole act in character. It was only in later antiquity that moral determinism came to be seen as a problem once the Stoics had raised the stakes. They were not only physicalists in the sense that everything that happens has physical causes and that the same causes always have the same effects, but they also assumed that there are general cosmic laws that determine the outcome of everything with necessity. Thus, it had been necessary from the dawn of creation on that Oedipus would kill his father and marry his mother. From then on, there was an incessant battle between determinists and indeterminists, a battle that was greatly intensified once God's will became an extra factor in the argument. But of all this, Aristotle knew nothing. He regarded it as up to us how to behave, and also, to a more limited degree, he treated it as up to us what kinds of persons we will turn out to be. And that is why he holds people responsible for their own actions.